On the table. I'll tell you a quick little story before I get into the long story. Most of you already heard, of course, I joined the Bruderhof community some years ago. And what was wonderful, one of the most wonderful things I ever had done in my life was when we arrived there as long-term guests, I took the wallet out of my pocket, put it in the little bedstand next to my bed, and didn't pull it out for, I think, 9 months. I didn't need it. Though, there's a drawback to that because one day, one of my jobs at the Bruderhof was as a driver. And I had to drive a van load of brothers and sisters over to another community. And so I got the car keys and started up the van, and everyone loaded up, and we're on our way over there, and I had to go over Toll Bridge. And I reached for my wallet, which wasn't in my pocket. And the toll taker, when I came up and he said, "I'm sorry, I'm embarrassed, I forgot to bring my wallet." He says, "It happens all the time, don't worry about it." I'm not too sure why Ernest asked me to explain why I'm an Anabaptist. In brief, I'd like to say that I'm an Anabaptist because I agree with the beliefs and practices that are fundamental to Anabaptism. And I believe sincerely that those beliefs and practices are the essentials of the New Testament teachings of Jesus. I'm actually glad that I was able to follow Dan Ziegler in his talk because Dan laid a great groundwork for what I want to address, and that is the whole point of Christocentrism. But instead of getting into more theological and technical details about that, I thought instead, seeing the crowd of people who are here, many of you from Mennonite backgrounds, I thought I'd share my own personal story in the context of how I arrived to want to follow after Jesus in the manner of the Anabaptists. And I prefer to use that phrase, to follow Jesus in the manner of the Anabaptists, instead of saying that I am an Anabaptist. Though, in fact, I am an Anabaptist. Anyone here, or how many other people here were baptized as infants? Can I see your hands? And how many of you were then rebaptized as adults? You're under arrest for the crime of Anabaptism. I was born and raised into a Roman Catholic family. I was baptized, or christened rather, at the age of about 2 weeks, and raised in the Roman Catholic Church by my parents. My father was a very devout Marianist, which is sort of they refer to it as a cult of Mary, which is kind of a strange term. Where? In
what part of the country? In
Massachusetts. I was raised in Lynn, Massachusetts. Lynn, the city of sin. You don't come out the way they come in. It was is the old, and I don't know the rest of the song, and I would rather not recite it anyway. But yes, I was raised in Lynn, Massachusetts. My parents were Roman Catholic. And we were raised as Roman Catholic. When I was 6 years old, I received my first Holy Communion in the Catholic tradition. And at about that time, my parents took me to a shrine of Our Lady of something or other. I don't remember. Our Lady of La Salette, I believe it was. In Roman Catholicism, you're all, I'm sure, at least to some degree familiar with the fact that Roman Catholicism has what's almost a pantheon of saints who have special occasions, special saint days, who are patrons over certain activities. We all remember the patron saint of driving, which was St. Christopher, yes. And people would put a St. Christopher medal in their car to protect them driving. Catholic people would. And I think it was in 1972, I'm not too sure how precisely saints get demoted, but St. Christopher was demoted, and he was no longer the patron saint he was no longer a saint. I think it was essentially because they had too many saints. But I don't know if they reminted the St. Christopher medal as the Mr. Christopher medal, but I've always thought about that since. And about the time I was 6 years old, as I say, I received my first communion, and we went to this shrine. This shrine was dedicated to Mary, the mother of Jesus, who has a very special place in the Roman Catholic Church. Essentially, some people are trying to have Mary proclaimed as the co-redemptrix with Jesus, co-redeemer with Jesus, and one of the part of the theology behind Mary goes back to the wedding at Cana. You pray to Mary because Jesus listens to his mother, and so Mary has this very special place in Roman Catholic theology. It's like Jesus is too hard a character for you to approach directly, and so you can approach Jesus. You can approach God by going to Mary, and Mary goes to Jesus, and Jesus goes to God. But among other things, Mary has had apparitions, the Roman Catholic Church, especially in popular Catholicism. People have claimed that Mary has appeared to them, given them special messages, special prophecies. And one occasion was at Mount Carmel. I don't even remember where exactly Mount Carmel was that she appeared, but she commissioned that if you wear this little brown tag, this is called a scapular, around your neck, and as part of saying the rosary and other devotions and such, as long as you're wearing that tag, you would not taste the fires of hell. You can look this up too. This is the little brown scapular. Little brown scapular. Look it up, because this is true. Now, as a 6-year-old boy, this was a great gift from my parents. They gave me this little brown scapular, but I'll tell you what, I was terrified that it was going to fall off of me. At night, I would be afraid of going to sleep because the scapular, now it would likelier choke me than fall off of me because we kept it on very tight, but I was terrified that this little brown tag, this little brown scapular would fall off of me and I might die that night and go to hell, because this was guaranteeing me that I would get into heaven. And actually, in the whole economy of the Roman Church, that was basically an indulgence. You've heard about indulgences in the Reformation, which is how Luther's 95 Theses, what really got him started was Tetzel was commissioned with selling indulgences, which it's a fee that you pay that reduces your time in purgatory. This was my Roman Catholicism, my upbringing. Very superstitious in its own way. And one of the things about growing up Roman Catholic is we didn't read the Bible. That was something that the priest did. It certainly wasn't necessary for us, and it was utterly confusing to read the Bible. You read the Bible, and there's a lot of things in there that just don't make sense. You instead attended Mass. You received communion, which imparted grace to you. You received the literal body and blood of Christ when you received communion. The Mass was a ceremony performed daily, actually, though you had to attend once a week in order to keep from going to hell. That's where the priest entirely recreated the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross. Again, this might sound very strange to you. This is what I grew up with. This was natural to me. About the time I reached the age of 14, I went to confirmation class. Because you're baptized as an infant in the Roman Catholic Church, they have to go through a process of confirming if this is real. Your godparents and your parents guarantee when you're baptized that they will raise you as a Christian. that they will raise you in the church. And by the time you get around the age of 14, you go through a confirmation process, which is basically you have to learn some new prayers and cite some statements confirming that it worked, that your godparents and your parents raised you as a good Catholic and a good Christian. And I went through that process, and that confirmed me as a good Roman Catholic. At about that time, just not too long after that, when I was 16 years old, my father died. And it's taken me a long time to really kind of face up to that and how influential that actually was at the time on my spiritual life. But because at about that same time, I was taking much more of an interest in the fact that I was Catholic, and I wanted to start reading the Bible, which was not really encouraged. And again, there weren't Bible studies for us or anything like that. I opened it up and started reading Genesis, and looking for Mary and the saints in there and such. And I really had no guidance in that. But when my father died, that really did intensify my seeking and my spiritual interests. And in high school, I had some friends that we played cards with at lunch. And they invited me to attend some youth meetings at their church. One of these friends was the daughter of a Nazarene minister there, and these were Nazarene revival meetings. And no one told me not to go, so I decided to go. And it was a series of meetings, and I heard preaching. I heard stuff that I'd never heard before. As a Roman Catholic boy, you didn't get Bible preaching. You got the Mass. You got a mumbled bit of the sermon in when I was a young boy. We got it in Latin, and went through the mumbo jumbo, if you don't mind my saying that. But this time, the preacher, he stands up with the Bible and reads out of the Bible some stuff I'd never heard before, and was preaching, and he wasn't mentioning the saints and Mary. He wasn't talking about praying to saints and Mary. He was talking about being born again, about our sinfulness and our sinful nature, and that needing to be removed from us, and that Jesus was the answer. And to make a long story short, after 3 nights of very intense revivalistic preaching, they had an invitation to the altar, an altar call, and I was very curious about this, so I went up. I was moved by the preaching. Something was stirring in me. There's no question about that. And I was asking about the Bible and what he was saying. What was he saying? Where was he getting this out of the Bible? And what about Mary and the saints? And he said, they're not in there. They're not in there, And that was a turning point in my life, because at that point I did have a conversion experience. And I'll get back to that later. I essentially prayed the sinner's prayer, and it was a moving experience. You can call it a born again. I called it a born again experience, that was really the turning point, a turning point in my life, one of several, in fact, when I started at that point turning to the Bible. And seeking after God in the Bible. The Bible that had pretty much been prohibited, that I was alienated from as a young Catholic boy. And of course, the first thing that, as with most evangelical churches, the first thing they directed me to read was the Gospel of John. I've never quite understood why the Gospel of John. Because especially for a new convert, it's very difficult to read. It's difficult because there's so much theological content on there. But I had a voracious appetite for the scriptures at that point. This was all new to me. This was wonderful. I'm reading about Jesus. I'm reading Jesus' own words. And so I got a Bible and I started tearing through it. I think probably in 2 days I read all the Gospels, reread them, read them again, read them in a couple different versions, As much as we might not like the Living Bible, I'm thankful for that translation at the time, because it wasn't all this thee and thou that was so difficult for a 16-year-old boy to understand, and the message got through to me. The message got through to me. As time went on, though, I started finding some difficulties. And let me step back a little bit onto back to my Roman Catholicism. When you encounter the words of Jesus and the things that he tells you to do, especially when you're looking at the Sermon on the Mount, there's a lot of different ways that different churches handle that. In the Roman Catholic Church, the hard sayings of Jesus, what he taught in the Sermon on the Mount and the Sermon on the Plain, are called the counsels of perfection. And that actually comes from Matthew, where a rich young ruler came up to Jesus and said, "What must I do to obtain eternal life?" You know the story. And Jesus went on to say, "If you want to be perfect." This is what the Roman Catholic Church taught me about that. Christ in the gospel laid down certain rules of life and conduct which must be practiced by every one of his followers as the necessary condition for attaining to everlasting life. These precepts of the gospel practically consist of the Decalogue or 10 Commandments of the Old Law, interpreted in the sense of the New Testament. Besides these precepts, which must be observed by all under the pain of eternal damnation, he also taught certain principles which he expressly stated were not to be considered as binding upon all, or as a necessary condition without which heaven could not be attained, but rather as counsels for those who desire to do more than the minimum and to aim at Christian perfection so far as can be attained here on earth. So in other words, here's the bare minimum. But, if you want to do a little bit of extra, you want some extra credit, you can practice these counsels of perfection. So what did I think when I was attending Nazarene Church as a new convert, and I started reading the Gospels and encountered these same counsels of perfection? And I asked. This was during the Vietnam War, when I was facing, in just a couple of years, the draft myself. And here Jesus is saying, love your enemies. But that's obvious. It's obvious to me that I couldn't go to war. I couldn't go shoot somebody because Jesus told us not to. So I asked, what are you going to preach on this? Are you telling us, I asked my pastor, are you telling us that we have to do these things? And that's where I kind of learned, someone else had mentioned it today, that's where I kind of learned the phrase, well, Jesus said thus and so, but what he really meant was. In the case of this, in the case of loving your enemies, yes, we want to love our enemies, but sometimes there's times of national emergency, and it becomes necessary for a Christian to serve their duty, and we're not going to bind your conscience. If you feel that you can't kill somebody, then you can still serve your country in some way and help your nation in a time of need. And more, through my time with the Church of the Nazarene, I kept hearing this over and over again. Jesus said thus and so, but what he really meant was. But I just had that desire, somehow, somewhere, I had that desire to go further, not to make myself more perfect, but to simply obey. It was a watered-down gospel as far as I'm concerned, as far as I was concerned. I actually went on to study for the ministry at the Nazarene College, which, quite frankly, if you have any doubts about your church's theology, it's the worst place to go. I took a year of Greek and a year of Bible studies while I was there. And what I found was I was largely being taught to dodge around what Jesus was telling us to do. Because after all you have to do is believe in Jesus for your salvation and trust in him for your salvation, and you're saved. And these other things, I don't know if they're pithy, but we were being taught to kind of dodge around those. And I wasn't satisfied with that. At the time, in fact, there were more military chaplains in my church than there were conscientious objectors. So I felt I had to leave that behind, and I was seeking more. And I actually ended up dropping out of college. I wouldn't say I was an agnostic, but I couldn't go that way. I couldn't go that evangelical way that saved me from my Catholicism. I had to go further. I had to go further. I'll mention one thing that was interesting is while I was at the Nazarene College studying for the ministry, I met my first Mennonite. Myron Augsburger came and preached our chapel services one week, and his preaching was amazing. It was again some things that I'd never heard before, and I actually used to have notes on those sermons. I don't have them anymore, so I don't remember exactly what he preached. But there was something distinctly different about what he was preaching. One funny story about that was he was wearing a plain coat at the time. I've mentioned that to some people. Did Myron ever wear a plain coat? He was wearing a plain coat. And I nudged the fellow next to me and I says, our ministers don't wear any kind of special garb. And the fellow sitting next to me said, all the Mennonites wear that. All the Mennonite men wear that. I said, really? So after leaving college, I hitchhiked around the country for a while. Kind of did my hippie thing, and eventually ended up back in Salem, Massachusetts, where I had some friends, and that's where I met my wife. And to make a long story short, through a Christian fellowship at Salem State College, we married, and having a similar upbringing. Betty was raised Roman Catholic as well. She converted into a congregational church, but both of us kind of resonated with wanting something more spiritually than just we're born again believers. And so we ended up getting involved with a Radical Evangelical Fellowship. Are you familiar with Radical Evangelicalism? Ron Sider is one of the popular names. It's sort of like we had a whole reading list. John Howard Yoder, Ron Sider's Rich Christians in the Age of Hunger, Sojourners Magazine, American Friends Service Committee. There was a little group that formed at this Nazarene College that I had attended, led by one of the professors, and several students that, in a very similar way to what I was experiencing, is like, Jesus said thus and so let's do it. And so we got involved with this little group, studying the scriptures, more actually studying the lexicon or the library of books that we're all supposed to read, including the politics of Jesus and other literature. We actually ended up becoming war tax resistors, and our personal solution to war tax resistance was we decided to live poor enough that we didn't have to pay taxes. We moved into our little group got involved in an inner city ministry that we were taking over in Roxbury. Some of us had a vision for community together, as in Acts 2 and 4. And so the church had offered us a property for our little group to do ministry in Roxbury, Massachusetts, which was a very poor, crime-ridden area. How many murders were there? There were 12 murders in our neighborhood of black women. In our neighborhood, we'd get off the subway and see an outline in the road. And racial tensions at the time in that area were very high. It was a relatively dangerous place to live. I actually learned some street smarts from the local fence, who taught me how to survive in that neighborhood. We were one of 2 white families in the neighborhood. So we certainly got to know the feeling of being a minority or being strangers in a strange land. But it was a good experience for us. We were zealous young people. We got to know the neighbors. We were part of the neighborhood. It was a joyful experience in our own way. But there were some tensions going on in the group, and it was very hard to figure out what it was. I won't go into all the details, but everything fell apart at one point when we found that there was sin in the group. And one of the things I would have to say that characterized that time is we were very socially active, social gospel oriented. But I would have to say the trajectory of that whole left-wing evangelical movement was into politics. The politics of Jesus more and more to us was becoming the left-wing politics. And as we saw this movement developing and moving forward, you can even see it to this day. This is the same movement that justifies homosexuality, that lifts feminism. My wife, in fact, is a charter member of the Evangelical Women's Caucus.
I've repented.
And in all sincerity, instead of loving our enemies, we were being conditioned to hate those on the right wing for not loving their enemies. There wasn't an answer there for us. Now, an odd thing happened in that time, though. We started learning more about Anabaptist Mennonites. We started subscribing to the Plow magazine, which was a magazine of the Bruderhof communities. And I'm keeping an eye on my time. But after that experience, which was a very rich experience in terms of sharing our lives with brothers and sisters and trying to take seriously the things that Jesus was telling us to do, and meeting people who were taking seriously the things that Jesus told us to do. Quite frankly, we just were square pegs in any church we could ever attend again. We tried some other evangelical churches. It just didn't work for us. At that time in our lives, we decided to go back to school. Originally we were really thinking more of doing mission work somewhere. We still had that zeal for doing that, but quite frankly, after my wife went to school for nursing for a couple of years, I worked, and she worked. We were both working full-time, going to school. I was going to school part-time. I went to university, a very, very hard, heavy course load. I was a student in electrical engineering for 4 years. I hardly even remember those 4 years, except for studying 14 hours a day. When I graduated, though, we were still confronted with that burning desire, that need. Now, I graduated into a recession. I graduated second in my engineering class. That means I did pretty well, and was expecting to find a job quite easily on the market. I was working as an intern for Digital Equipment Corporation. We were making our plans for the future at that point. After 4 years of university, we were looking forward to just settling in a quiet place, having a nice little engineering job, earning a good salary that we deserved at that point. The fire had dimmed. The fire of mission and such had dimmed. But as I said, graduated into a recession, and the company that I was expecting to hire me didn't hire me. They had a hiring freeze. So for all my ambition, I was left unemployed and seeking work. I think another one of those turning points happened then, though, when I was looking for a job. There were not too many jobs available. There were jobs available for defense contractors. And I still couldn't do that. I still couldn't see my way to do that. One day I went for a job interview. I didn't know much about the company, Spire Corporation. And they were offering me a position as a mathematician. My minor was mathematics. I loved mathematics. I loved spending 3 hours doing a 16-page math problem. I know, that's sick, isn't it? And my particular, I happen to be especially talented at some particular types of mathematics called special functions. And this company was looking for a couple of young mathematicians that could sit there all day and do these incredibly complex mathematical problems, which if they gave, the computer would take about 24 hours to process, but if they gave it to one of us mathematicians, we could reduce that time with the type of calculations we were doing to, 10 minutes of computer time. It looked like just a wonderful opportunity. They were going to hire 2 mathematicians. We'd have our own secretary. We'd have access to a Cray supercomputer. We'd have a secretary who would just go get books for us. An incredible opportunity. Right out of college, right into the field that I love, and they were a military contractor. And what was interesting about that was, yes, of course I hesitated. I'd been unemployed for 6 months. Here was an incredible opportunity, and I had to say, I can't do it. I can't do it. I love the job. They were offering to send me to MIT for my master's and even my doctorate degree as part of my employment contract. He's dangling these things in front of me. For a mathematician, that's like taking me up to the highest mountain and offering me kingdoms. But I had to refuse, and as it turns out, the hiring manager, the man I would have worked for, was a Christian, and I had to explain to him why I wouldn't take the position. And we talked for about 2 hours about the fact that Jesus told us to love our enemies, and I can't work in an industry that's designing the hardware to kill our enemies. So I had to walk away from that. Dan mentioned glass and height. Thinking about it, that might have been the first time I experienced anything like glass and height. I told you I had a born-again experience. There's another experience that we don't talk about, that we don't promote, and that is the glass and height experience. I had to walk away from a dream job after 4 years of very hard college. And I had to walk away from it for Jesus' sake. And that's good. And that was good for me. And God rewarded me for that in ways that I still don't understand. He rewarded me for doing that with poverty, with struggles, with not knowing on occasions, years ahead of the years in the future of that, and not knowing, having to make a decision between buying milk and buying gas so I could go to work. But those types of decisions led us onto a more radical path. And again, God works in mysterious ways, I guess we can say. Because we'd heard about Mennonites, and we'd heard about Mennonite churches, and we'd read about Mennonites, and from a distance we admired Mennonites, but as later we discovered in talking to one of the Mennonite bishops, the Mennonite bishop of our district there, Lancaster Mennonite bishop, New England is where Mennonites go to get away from Mennonites. So there were never any Mennonite churches. Well, it happened at about that time we found out that a Mennonite church had started just a couple of years before, about 20 miles away from us. So we started attending there. It kind of snowballed from there. We started the native New Englanders that were part of that. This was a church planting, mostly Mennonites who had come to New England to get away from Mennonites, but still liked having the potlucks, and so they started a church and let some of us native New Englanders participate. And the odd thing of it is, and it's one of these seekers things, you guys know what I'm talking about, who are the most radical people in a Mennonite church like that? Was us native New Englanders. These native Mennonites that had come up from Ohio, Lancaster County, from all over the country, they're trying to discourage our sisters, our native New England sisters, from wearing the head covering. And our native sisters are starting to look more like old Lancaster Mennonites. And that's where I really started getting into the whole Mennonite world and studying much more the Anabaptism that I had seen from a distance. We eventually decided with a small group of us that we would try our own little, start our own little group. We were certainly more conservative than the Mennonite church and starting to come into conflict with them. And so a group of native New Englanders decided to start the New England Anabaptist Fellowship. We had started having contact with the Old Order River Brethren, with some other conservative groups, through some friends and such. We were starting, as a group of seekers, we were starting to take on the dress of the Old Order River Brethren, which quite frankly was peculiar for an electrical engineer. I was working as an electrical engineer at that time at a university, quite frankly, I was quite a sight to see a plain-dressed man in Lowell, Massachusetts, working in electrical engineering department. Scandalous, you might say. In fact, one of our members was a coworker, to make a long story short, through my ministering to him, through his seeing changes in my life, he himself became a seeker. He and I had been classmates, and then we worked at the university together. And he was very much drawn to this following after Jesus, to the authentic message of Jesus. It's essentially someone saying, instead of saying Jesus said thus and so, but what he really meant was, here was something that I could present in this context of Mennonitism, in this understanding of the scripture that was new, that was growing in me, that Jesus said this, and he really meant it. And so he himself was starting to turn and was starting to seek himself. One of his professors pulled him aside and said, you know, this religion thing is really great, and don't get me wrong, it's good for you, but maybe you want to choose a more respectable church. Episcopalians, or you know, if they're too high church for you, you know, maybe some other, you know, the Advent or whatever, but certainly nothing like Mennonitism. In this time, though, again, following a more radical path, shortly before all of this, I had injured my neck. I have arthritis in my neck, and occasionally I'll get a pinched nerve there, which does nothing but cause me pain. And this was slowly developing at this time. I was only in my early 30s at the time. And the doctors really couldn't do anything for me. And one day I had this terrible spasm in my neck. Again, drugs couldn't help it, nothing. So the doctor told me, all you can do is sit down, find a comfortable position, and stay there until, you know, for as long as you can. And so I really had nothing else to do but to read my Bible. Now, this was before I had jumped ahead, I'm sorry, but this was before we had found the Mennonite church. And at about that time, someone had challenged me. We were at the point after college that in our spiritual life, I had kind of accepted, well, I'm saved. I accepted Jesus as my Savior. I'm trusting in him for my salvation. But somebody challenged me to look in the New Testament and underline everything in the New Testament that Jesus said to do. And so I did that. I had nothing else to do. And so basically I spent 3 days in intensive Bible study, trying to ease this pain in my neck, underlining everything that Jesus said to do, reading it intensely. And I discovered something that Jesus really did tell us to do a lot. More than that, he told us why he wants us to do his will, so that we'd be children of his Father. And if I had time, I would read you some of the pertinent scriptures, but 10 minutes. So that was part of our radicalization process. And I just want to mention that because it was sort of an answer to that old, Jesus said thus and so, but what he really meant was. Well, at that point, we were being quite radicalized. Jesus said thus and so, and he really meant it. I always like Dean Taylor's phrase, what if Jesus meant every single word that he said? And that's where we were in our life as coming into Mennonite backgrounds, a Mennonite background. But of course, quite frankly, one of the things that Jesus said as we were going through this radical period is he had told a rich young ruler who came to him and asked, what must I do to obtain eternal life? As an evangelical, that was a pretty easy one. Jesus really didn't mean that because he just, it was just what was in his heart that counted. But then I, in my underlining process, I had come across in the Gospel of Luke 12:33. Now, I had always had the idea that Jesus had gone to this rich young man, or rather, this rich young man had come to Jesus, and this was sort of one of those one-off things, like the Roman Catholic said, if you want to be perfect. That there was something particular about that rich young man until I was going through my underlined Bible, and I noticed in Luke 12:33 a very unusual promise where Jesus said, do not be afraid. It's starting with verse 32. Do not be afraid, little flock, because your Father delights to give you the kingdom of heaven. The kingdom. Sell your possessions and give to the poor. He wasn't talking to a rich young ruler. He was talking to all of his disciples. And at that point in our lives, we were starting to take the words of Jesus quite literally. And so we had to ask, well, how can we do this? How can we sell our possessions and give to the poor? At that time, we started visiting the Bruderhof communities. And we quite sincerely thought we found the answer in that. And that is exactly and precisely what we did at that point in our lives. We sold our possessions. We quit our jobs. My wife had been working as a nursing supervisor. At that point, when we joined the Bruderhof, or left to join the Bruderhof, we decided to start a family. So we sold everything, most everything we had, turned the rest over to the Brotherhood, and went from, at that point, I had a fairly decent job at the university, and a nice apartment and a nice car, to putting my wallet in the bedside table and living in a little room 10 by 10 feet maybe with our baby. That was all just a matter of taking Jesus at his word. That's our story. That's our basic story of how we got here. If I had a lot more time, if I was able to do part 2, I wanted to jump on to the why of that. And the why of that is taking Jesus seriously. It is the why Anabaptism is because of that Christocentric hermeneutic that Dan referred to. Looking at Jesus first, interpreting the scriptures from a Jesus perspective. And that's been a rich experience of ours to instead of playing the hermeneutic games that I was being trained to do in college as I was studying for the Nazarene ministry, we could just take Jesus at his word. And here we found among the Anabaptists a people who took Jesus at his word. And as we studied church history and studied the early Anabaptists, we found a real resonance with what they were doing. We could agree with what they were doing. These were people like us. In fact, more literally like us than we realized when you look at the very first generation of Anabaptists, the very first leaders of the Anabaptists. They were college students, in fact. Someone mentioned that they were in their 20-odd-year-old men. They were graduate students. And they found they found a sincerity and a reality that, like myself, I could not find in the Roman Church, that I couldn't find in the Protestant Church. The hermeneutic acrobatics of explaining away what Jesus was doing. And the important thing of that, the important lesson in that is something that Chris had mentioned in a discussion, a late night discussion just a couple months ago, was a discovery that the Anabaptists have a very high intellectual ceiling, which might sound a little bit strange, but the simple fact is, what that really means is it makes sense. It's common sense. You don't have to do gymnastics. You don't have to do dodge. You take Jesus at his word. And that's what we found in our Anabaptist seeking, and that's why we're here tonight. Because we can take Jesus at his word and simply do what he asks us to do and intends us to do.